Cryptids, war heroes, conspiracies, lost media and fried chocolate. I'm Matt and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. Today we're doing something a little different. Iceberg charts are a popular modern way of taking a subject and delving deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole, and to be honest it has helped some YouTubers get way more popular, and I'd be a fool not to try and replicate the idea. I know what you're thinking, an iceberg chart isn't a cryptid or a ghost story or any of my usual affair, but I will only be doing British Isles based icebergs, and there is an argument to be made, the one I'm making, that they technically fall within the realms of folklore, and folklore is part of my usual affair. While I found a few that narrow their vision into specific areas, I thought why not kick off with one appropriately and generically titled The UK Iceberg. This is from a 2020 Reddit post from a now deleted user, but the iceberg is still there if you want to take a look. Also, say hello to side camera. Hello. As soon as I go bald, my transition into Harry Hill will be complete. Okay, let's get cracking. Starting off with a brilliant one. This is related to a 70-metre supermarket tunnel in the Cornish seaside town of Bude that links the store to the car park, presumably as a way of protecting patrons from the weather as they make the inconvenient trek from their car to the store, since it's unusual for a car park to be at the back of a supermarket instead of the front. For some reason, a local resident listed the tunnel on TripAdvisor as a place to visit and has been quoted as saying they did it because they have admired it for a while. Naturally, British humour took hold and people started giving it 5-star ratings and glowing comments, to the point where it's now showing as one of, if not the, best attractions in the town, and sits at the top of Bude's things to do list on the website. The reviews are amazing, including one person who says they've been to the North Pole and tracked lemurs in Madagascar, but nothing compares to Bude Tunnel, another calling it a masterpiece of engineering, and one saying they ambled for hours on end walking through the plethora of activities and, let's be honest, pure beauty. Honestly, this is the perfect introduction to Britain for anyone curious about what this mad nation is all about. I'm not entirely sure why this one's on here, as far as reasons it should be in an iceberg are concerned. For those who don't know, The Office was a fly-on-the-wall mockumentary comedy series written by Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant about a regional office for a paper company in Slough and the daily goings-on of its characters, chiefly the try-hard manager David Brent. It might be on here because it was such a seminal series in the UK, it went on to spawn a hugely successful American version, and it really elevated the potential of mockumentary comedies. Not saying they hadn't been done before, things like This Is Spinal Tap springs to mind as an example of it being done previously, but for sitcoms it wasn't really a popular thing, but now there are loads of them. It also might be on here because of the effect it had on offices, both people trying for some reason to manage the same way as David Brent, and for the people who realised their own managers were as bad or worse. Do I really need to say anything about Nessie? She was the subject of my very first video, and even if you haven't watched it, everyone knows who Nessie is. Moving on. Giant's Causeway is an area on the Northern Irish coast that was formed millions of years ago by intense volcanic activity, creating this really cool rock formation that looks like hexagonal stepping stones. The formation itself is actually quite a common result of volcanic activity, but Giant's Causeway is probably the most famous because of how man-made it looks compared to other examples. Beyond just the cool geological feature, naturally somewhere like this is steeped in mythology. The story goes that an Irish giant, or an Irish folk hero depending on what you read, called Finn McCool was challenged to a fight by a Scottish giant called Benadonna. Finn builds the causeway across the North Channel so that he can face the other giant and fight him. There is a similar rock formation at Fingal's Cave on the Scottish coast that probably gave rise to the idea that it used to be one long giant built bridge. The full story will probably feature in a Giants video I do at some point, but there are two versions. In one, Finn wins the fight and that's it. In the other, Finn sees Ben and Donna is way bigger than he is, so he then runs away. He then gets his wife to dress him up as a baby and puts him in the cradle. Ben and Donna crosses the causeway, sees Finn, and thinking that this is actually Finn's baby, thinks, wow, if this is his baby, that guy must be massive. So runs back to Scotland and destroys the causeway as he does, so Finn can't chase after him, hence why only the two coastal endpoints still exist. The shipping forecast, for those who don't know, is a radio broadcast the BBC runs a few times a day that basically gives weather reports for the shores around the British Isles so that people on ships know how much rain to expect, wind speed and direction, weather warnings and so on. It's been going for over 150 years at this point, obviously starting via telegraph instead of radio. The ASMR part probably relates to the fact that people have been known to use it to relax or fall asleep to. The way it's presented is said to be quite rhythmic and almost poetic. It stirs the imagination about being in a fishing boat on the coast at night and just calmly bobbing along. People appreciate that because it describes the British coast split into 31 areas, a lot of which don't really mean anything to you if you're not a boater or whatever, that it has an almost fantasy element to it as well. Funny side note, if anyone's ever seen the episode of Black Books where Tamsin Gregg's character enjoys herself to the voice of that guy she fancies, played by Peter Serafinowicz, it's the shipping forecast that he's broadcasting during her private playtime. Probably another well-known one, this is a town in Anglesey in Wales with the longest place name in the world. The proper pronunciation of the place name is Llanfair Pwllgwyn Gilgor Geraquin Drobwn Llandasilio Gogogo. Nailed it! The name translates to St Mary's Church in the hollow of the White Hazel near to the rapid whirlpool of Llandasilio of the Red Cave, referencing areas such as the whirlpool in the nearby Menai Strait and the chapel of St Cecilio on a nearby island. The name was supposedly made up in the 19th century as a publicity stunt to give their train station the longest name of any train station in Britain, but there are parish records that exist prior to that where the name isn't as long, but it is still pretty ridiculous. I actually spent some time living in the area when I was younger, and when I say younger, still an adult, that's how old I am, and the locals just call the place Llanfair PG because why wouldn't you? This is where my English language degree, 15 years after I got it, finally comes into use in my life. It's pretty simple to be honest. Glottal stops are a vocalic tic common with a lot of regional accents that I've used several times just in this sentence that you might not have noticed. The glottis is the opening between vocal folds, and the glottal stop is when you obstruct the airflow through it to make a noise. A common example for it is saying uh-oh, because you have to put a glottal stop in between the words to stop it just becoming oh-oh. An example that seems to be used in multiple places to describe the effect is how Cockneys say butter instead of butter, as if Cockneys were the only regional group that can't be bothered pronouncing T's. You want to know about not pronouncing T's? Get to Yorkshire, mate. This relates to a roundabout in Swindon. Obviously, that is one of the weirdest traffic management decisions I've ever seen. Essentially, it is a roundabout with 5 exits, but instead of that being it, each exit is also a roundabout. This picture explains it more than I can describe it, to be honest, but I can only imagine how nervous learner drivers are if their route goes through this. Remarkably, it was voted the 4th scariest junction in Britain, so I really need to do some research as to what fresh hell the top 3 are. Its name, The Magic Roundabout, comes from the children's TV series of the same name. That TV show is famous for the rumours that the creators were drugged up to the eyeballs when they made it, and I can only imagine Frank Blackmore, the creator of this roundabout, was as well when he thought that this was a good idea. The BBC Test Card, also formerly known as Test Card F, was something the BBC would transmit when there were no programmes being broadcast. Seems strange in these days where they fill the airtime with Friends reruns or Shamcloth adverts or whatever, but back in the day they basically went, okay, no more TV today, and showed them this instead. Because it's been around since the 1960s, it's been referenced and memed in all sorts of shows, and even the BBC has versions of it for their website error pages, which is actually kind of funny. Interesting fact, the young girl Carol Hersey, because of how often this test card was on the air since the 60s, she holds the record for appearing on screen more than any living person, estimated at around 70,000 hours, or nearly 8 full years on TV. Though, give it a few more years and I expect Rosie Jones will be able to break that record. Spotted Dick is a steamed pudding made with suet and dried fruit. Personally, I think it's disgusting, but that's because I hate dried fruit. It's a pretty traditional dish, first published as a recipe in 1849, but is probably most famous because of its name. The spotted part relates to the bits of dried fruit you can see in it, and dick is an old word for pudding, possibly related to the word dough. But obviously it also sounds like a euphemism for contracting an STD, so delicious. I don't really know why this is on here, presumably because it's the only version of a GTA game set outside of the USA maybe. It was an expansion pack to the first GTA game, created back then by DMA Design before they were bought by Take-Two and turned into Rockstar North. It was one of the earliest instances I can remember of a PlayStation 1 game where you had to put in the original disc and then the expansion disc to play it, which really annoyed me because I bought it with my Christmas money, didn't actually have the original GTA, and so I had to return it and I bought GTA 2. Not that that story is relevant in any way. Interestingly, recently in the lead up to GTA 6 releasing, if it ever does, at the time of recording still November, but we'll see, discussions have been made about a future game going back to London, but a spokesperson from Rockstar has said the issue they have trying to do something like that is the availability of guns anywhere outside the US, so let's not hold our breath. Joseph Merrick was a man with severe physical deformities who lived during the 19th century and worked as a freak show circus attraction known as the Elephant Man. Nobody's quite sure what his condition was. The latest assumption is he suffered both from Proteus syndrome and neurofibromatosis, two conditions that seem to cause abnormal tumours to grow across the body, the former affecting tissue and bones, the latter affecting the nervous system. There's a great David Lynch film of the same name that you can watch if you want to see his story, starring John Hurt of all people as Merrick, under what I can only assume is a colossal amount of prosthetics. This is such a well-known conspiracy, I'm quite surprised it's not in tier 1. I'll probably do a video on it at some point in my mystery series, but basically the premise is that Paul McCartney died very early into the life of the Beatles, and to stop the public from being sad about it, the rest of the band decided to replace him with a lookalike. The theory hilariously suggests MI5 helped them do it because I'm sure in the mid to late 1960s the UK's primary intelligence network didn't have anything better to do. And what's even funnier is that despite going to that kind of length to cover up Paul's death, the Beatles then decided to hide clues in their songs and album covers for people to uncover the truth. So their bandmate dies, they get the country's domestic counterintelligence security agency to help them cover it up, and then they think, screw it, let's just quietly tell people anyway. I honestly don't have the time in this video to go into all of the clues and theories and everything, so I'll definitely do a solo video about it. Some of the clues are such a stretch that it's actually quite funny, especially how annoyed Paul seems to get about the whole thing whenever anyone brings it up. I can only assume that this is in the Iceberg because James Bond himself and Rare, the developers of GoldenEye 64, are from the UK. But basically there's a half-finished level called Citadel hidden in the game files of GoldenEye 64, and people aren't sure whether it's a scrapped final level, an original design for a current level that was scrapped in favour of the level that did make it in, or the option most people think is correct, a test area quickly built for the developers to test the movement mechanics of the game. Dolphins in the Thames is a relatively new phenomenon where on several occasions in recent years dolphins have been found either swimming around in the Thames or dead on its shores. For those not aware, the Thames is a major UK river that runs right through London. I probably don't need to explain it any more than that really. It's a big famous river. Obviously dolphins shouldn't be in the Thames, especially as far inland as London, which is where the weirdness comes in. This iceberg was made in 2020 as far as I can tell, but even in 2024 there have been 4 separate reports that I can find of dolphins spotted in the Thames or dead on its banks, so the phenomena continues to this day. This was a name given to William Joyce and a few colleagues who used a German radio station to broadcast Nazi propaganda in English to listeners in the UK. The idea was to counteract the "we're giving the Jerrys a jolly good thrashing" reels that you'd see before movies and on the radio by trying to demoralise the population with reports of all the losses and defeats the Allies had experienced at the hands of the Germans. The transmissions eventually stopped when the British Army took Hamburg, the city the broadcasts were being made from, with the final transmission being made by a German Jewish refugee announcing the British takeover and eventually helping the Allies to arrest Joyce. The fact that this iceberg says Opium War instead of Wars makes me think maybe it's referring to something else, but I honestly can't find anything besides the historical Opium Wars. So there were 2 wars fought between Britain and China in the 19th century, though the French did help us out in the second one, in which China lost both and had to give in to some pretty heavy British demands. As with all wars, the nuances and steps that led to them are many and would take a long time to explain and too long for this video, so let's get on with a really short version. Britain has a 3-step trade cycle where they trade from Britain to India, India to China, China to Britain. In India they were mass producing opium and selling it to China, making a ton of money in the process. The Chinese steadily became achingly addicted to it, and the Chinese emperor got mad at the influence this was having on his population. Eventually, after some internal struggles, the Chinese decided to ban opium imports, crack down on smuggling, and eventually waylaid some British merchants, seizing and destroying their opium stocks. The British were fuming, basically saying to China, "Get with the times, man," and embrace free trade, so went to war. This was the first war. The Chinese lost and had to grant some concessions to the British. However, they dragged their feet doing it, so the British went to war again, beat them again, and won Hong Kong in the process. Also, a French missionary was executed in China around this time, which gave the French an excuse to get in and just kick China a bit for some reason as well. Probably better known by the phrase "Kilroy was here," Mr. Chad is one of the many names given to the cartoon character that accompanied that phrase and was found scrawled on walls and other things all over the theatre of war in World War II. It was basically a meme that both British and American soldiers took part in, places where they were stationed or encamped, or places they had taken in battle. Someone always seemed to draw this silly graffiti and write "Kilroy was here." There's so many theories about where it came from and so many other names it was known by and the origins for it that maybe that warrants his own video as well. One thing I do want to note though is, hilariously, it became so ubiquitous in areas of Allied victory that allegedly Hitler himself thought Kilroy was some amazing Allied spy who was lurking around all the German bases and trolling that he'd been there, which is probably just a story, but I love the idea of Hitler visiting a fortress or something, seeing this stupid bald dude poking his nose over a wall and stamping his feet like, "Damn you, Kilroy, I forget you one of these days." Nice self-explanatory one this. The classic Monty Python film Life of Brian, which followed the titular Brian as an accidental messiah, originally had a scene with a radical Jew named Otto who looked like Hitler, had the same ideas as Hitler, and had followers wearing a Star of David and swastika. Terry Jones, a Python member who directed the film, said they cut the scene not because of it being offensive, but because the film's story didn't need it and it sort of got in the way of the flow, though he did regret that afterwards and thinks they should have kept it in. I also think it's funny they cut that scene out for not being needed by the story, but the 5-minute sequence where Brian accidentally ends up in an alien spaceship in the middle of a dogfight was totally necessary. This is another one that would take way too long to go into detail with, so I'll just give the bare facts. While the rest of England was steadily being overtaken by the Saxons and eventually formed as England, Cornwall was still thoroughly Celtic and a separate kingdom to the Saxon ones. Eventually Cornwall was absorbed into England as well. Nobody's exactly sure when, as some writings state King Athelstan let them stay independent when he pushed their borders back, others think he'd already brought them under English control by then, who knows. However, they were still viewed as an entirely separate culture. Even as far as the 15th century, Cornwall was being described as a separate part to the nation of England, as far as language, culture and ethnicity is concerned. Over the centuries, Cornwall, at least on the surface, seemed to lose their separate identity, generally at the same rate at which the Cornish language died out, so that by the 19th century practically nobody spoke it at all, and Cornwall was officially English. Then, in the early 20th century, a man named Henry Jenner started a movement to bring back the Celtic nationalism of Cornwall and revive the language. The idea of a Cornish assembly and a full independence have stirred multiple times over the years, but not really to any avail. They were given status as a national minority by the EU in 2014, but then we left the EU, so I guess that doesn't matter anymore. Also, every time someone starts a petition for Cornish independence to be brought up in Parliament again, they never get enough signatures, so apparently the majority of Cornwall doesn't care. So I'm not 100% sure what this is in reference to, as there's a few different things related to Scotland and nuclear testing that I could find, none of which seem to relate to each other. I did see a trend of Scottish people making jokes about testing on places like Fife and Paisley with some superbly edited photographs, but this seems to have become a trend much more recently than when this iceberg was made. There's also some stories I found about testing being done in Scotland to find alternatives to nuclear bombs, like a bubonic plague bomb that they tested out on guinea pigs in the Hebrides for some reason, but obviously that's not nuclear testing, it is in fact quite the opposite. I also found some old reports about how Britain's nuclear testing during the Cold War led to Scotland getting more rain than usual for a few years, so it could be that, but honestly I have no idea. You've probably seen this. The giant is a big chalk figure on a hill in Dorset, brandishing a big club in his hand and a big something else between his legs. The origins are actually unknown. At first people assumed it was from the Saxon period and was one of their gods, even though there's no evidence to back that up. The earliest reference to it in writing is from the 17th century, so people naturally assumed it must have been made then, as surely you would expect a massive drawing of a giant on a hill would crop up at least a few times in writing in the 700 years between the Saxons and the first written account. More recently, however, some optically stimulated luminescence tests were done that gave a rough origin date between 700 and 1110 AD. So, nice tight timeline there. But meaning it could well be Saxon in origin. Either way, it's a popular tourist spot, obviously well involved in local folklore and seen as a sign of fertility. I mean, obviously it is. This is about the allegations that former King Edward VIII had leanings towards the Nazi Party. During a visit to Germany a couple of years before World War II broke out, which the British government advised him not to do, Edward and his wife Wallis Simpson went to meet Hitler, gave Nazi salutes, was well treated by their hosts and all that jazz. Some people involved said that he was interested in the Nazis because he saw them as an ally against communism and wanted to ally with them because after what he'd witnessed during World War I, he was dead against the potential of another war and wanted allies instead of enemies. Hitler is even quoted as saying that he thought if Edward hadn't abdicated, Britain would have been a good friend to Germany and the Second World War would have gone very differently. But obviously Edward wasn't king, so Germany had to take the L on that one. For those not in the know, Coronation Street is Britain's longest running soap opera, set mainly on the fictional street in Manchester and featuring the usual stuff you would find in British soaps, 90% mundane everyday nonsense interspersed with affairs, murders, explosions and at one point even a tram crash. I assume the video game the Iceberg is talking about is The Mystery of the Missing Hot Pot Recipe, a PC game released in 2011. It looks like a typical point-and-click adventure game set in the Corrie multiverse, where you help Betty, a long-time character who worked in the pub and famously made a stewed meal called a hot pot, find a new recipe for one. I assume it didn't sell very well because the typical video game audience and the typical Corrie audience overlaps by about 3 people. Also for a fun read, Google Betty Hotpot Snoop Dogg. Mad Jack, also known as Fighting Jack, was an officer in the British Army who during World War II fought using a longbow and a broadsword, and also carried a set of bagpipes around with him everywhere. Obviously. To be honest, there's so much cool stuff about this guy that he might be worth his own video as well, or at least I'd encourage you to read up about him yourself. I do like one story where he was leading a group of soldiers in Yugoslavia against the Germans. His team came under mortar fire and only he survived, and was captured by the Germans, who spotted him walking amongst the rubble playing his bagpipes. Clearly the name Mad Jack was warranted with this guy. This relates to an explosion at an underground munitions storage facility in 1944, historically one of the largest non-nuclear explosions ever experienced. 3,500 to 4,000 tons of munitions exploded, leaving a 100-foot deep, 100-foot wide crater, completely destroying a nearby farm, totally destroying a nearby reservoir, which also caused severe flooding, and killing around 70 people overall. The cause was hidden at first, lest enemy intelligence find out, but revealed many years later to likely have been caused by a worker removing a detonator from a live bomb using a brass chisel that created the spark that set off the explosion. Why you would decide defusing a bomb by whacking it with a lump of metal is a good idea, I'll never know. The crater is still there to this day, admittedly now overgrown with trees and such, and is fenced off with no admittance signs warning of unexploded bombs in the area. There's also a memorial stone just outside the fence to honour the dead. Had to leave this one till the end because it is absolutely ridiculous. This was a 1990 sitcom written by Jeff Atkinson, set in 1938 Berlin, where Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun lived next door to a Jewish couple. The idea was to parody the typical American family-style sitcoms of the 50s and 60s, the usual grumpy, frustrated husband, airhead wife, annoying neighbours, and apparently also to parody that sitcoms of the time would embrace any idea, no matter how stupid. This series never made it past the first episode, despite 8 being filmed overall, and I probably don't need to explain why. The pilot involved a visit from Neville Chamberlain and ends up with most characters drunk and in a conga, while Hitler hides the Peace for Our Time agreement in an icebox. Fortunate that it did get cancelled immediately, because the overarching plot would apparently focus on Hitler's attempts to kill off his Jewish neighbours, so if people thought the pilot was tasteless, I can only imagine how much worse it would have gotten. This is a pretty basic one. Despite routine dredging of the Thames every year, now and then they still come across German or Allied bombs and need to get them defused or destroyed. There's also a ship called the SS Richard Montgomery that ran ashore on a sandbank in 1944 that remains within the Thames estuary and is protected by the 1973 Protection of Wrecks Act. It contains approximately 1,400 tons of explosives still on board. The masts are visibly poking out of the water, and due to their deterioration and the weight, the government has repeatedly attempted to remove them, because experts believe if they were to fall naturally it would set off the explosives, but so far attempts have been thwarted by items and objects being found on the seabed that deemed it too dangerous to go ahead with the work. A 1970 BBC report predicted that if explosions did go off, the nearby town of Sheerness will suffer greatly. These are really well known, at least in the UK, so it's weird that they're so far down the iceberg, but there's not really much else to say. The Mars chocolate bar is dipped in batter and then chucked in a deep fat fryer, and I assume is delicious because I've never actually had one. Even I'm surprised at that, and I am me. It started off as a novelty item in a Scottish fish and chip shop, but when word spread, chippies around the country decided it sounded like a great idea and started doing it themselves. A Scottish chef even introduced them to his restaurant in Paris, so you're welcome, France. Argleton is the first entry on the iceberg that we could start exploring the rabbit hole of the Mandela effect and parallel universes. First written about in 2008, Argleton was shown as a town on Google Maps in West Lancashire, near to the village of Orton. The problem was Argleton did not exist, and the pinpoint for it on maps was the middle of an empty field. Because Google data is used by other businesses, it suddenly appeared on things like location lists for estate agents, locations for weather reports, and so on. There are all sorts of theories about what happened, from a glitch in the system to a misspelling of nearby Orton that was corrected but not removed, to a copyright trap for any competing map providers stealing Google's data. Of course, the coolest theory is that Argleton does exist in a parallel universe, and a Googleer who inputted the data for this part of the map was from that universe and didn't realise that they'd crossed over to ours. Part of me feels like this is a joke entry. I can find information on negative emotional auras in general, and that's the phenomenon where a place, person or thing causes an unsettling, weird vibe and you just don't want to have anything to do with it. The energy of the thing just makes you feel uncomfortable. And Slough itself is one of those places in the UK that gets routinely mocked for being a bit drab and unappealing, so maybe this entry is either jokes that Slough suffers from an NEA, or theories as to that's why it has this reputation. Rockhall is basically a big rock poking out of the Atlantic that's a few hundred kilometres away from the UK and is claimed as part of the UK's territory. Nobody had claimed it until the UK did in 1955, and the only real benefit for that is the potential to claim fishing rights nearby. Interestingly, despite being just a random rock in the middle of the sea, several new species were discovered that appear to be native to the rock. Sadly, they are a sea snail, 2 types of clam and a worm, so not majorly exciting. Roanoke is a really cool story, and definitely video worthy. I don't know whether it steps outside the bounds of this channel or not. It was a British colony, but it was in America. But it's an interesting story and has some cool theories attached to it, so I'll probably cover it at some stage. In short, the colony was the first attempt at a permanent English settlement in America, set up by Sir Walter Raleigh, that was founded in 1585, and then when visited in 1590, the colonists had all disappeared, and multiple attempts over the centuries to find them have still proven futile, including using modern archaeological and genetic methods. The key part of the theory is that on one of the posts for the colony's wall, someone had scribbled the word Croatoan on there, after already writing Crow on a post further out that they may have had to abandon writing for whatever reason. The boring theory is that they were just saying they were relocating to nearby Hatteras Island that was called Croatoan after the Native American tribe that lived there of the same name. But more interesting theories abound about a surprise attack or an ambush through to a mysterious demon or plague. If you've seen the Supernatural episode Croatoan, the demon plague theory is in that. The only thing I found when looking for information about this was just uploads of the music itself onto various platforms. I guess this is on the list because of how weird and eerie the music is. The track contains low-end bassy tones that doesn't really have a whole lot of melody or structure to it, but is also filled with sound effects of people screaming, chains, gunshots, just all sorts of weird stuff. To be fair, it does sort of sound like you're in hell, so you gotta give them props for that one. The UK relation is because Team 17, the developers of Worms Armageddon, are a British developer based in Yorkshire. West Frew, don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not, is an RAF station based in Scotland that acts as a training school. The incident in question was in 1957 and remains the UK's most reported UFO case. Another one that is fully worth its own video, so I won't go into any detail here as it is a lot of stuff to unravel and I'd rather take my time with the research. The Strid is a patch of water in West Yorkshire known as the deadliest patch of water in the world and dubbed the Killer Creek or the stream that swallows people. Basically, it's a point where the banks of the normally quite wide River Wharfe suddenly and significantly narrow and drop, creating this clashing of currents where the river effectively turns on its side, pushing hundreds of galleons of water through a 6-foot gap that has been measured to be about 200 feet deep. Anyone who falls in gets pulled under instantly and bashed about on the rocks to the point that it just obliterates them. Nobody who has ever fallen in has ever survived, and on most occasions their bodies are never recovered either. Incidents have been recorded since the 12th century and as recently as 2010. Anyone who's seen the other videos on the channel will know about this because I've already covered it. The Big Grey Man haunts the mountain of Ben Macdouey, second highest in Britain, and while most people who report it have never seen it, all have reported feeling an unease and a need to get off the mountain. I have no idea why this is so far down the iceberg. Also known as black pudding, it's a sausage made of cow or pig blood, fat or suet, and some kind of oat wrapped up in a casing that used to be something like a lung or intestine, but these days is usually synthetic. And it's disgusting. Don't at me. The only thing I could find about why it might be controversial despite its less than appetising description is that the regional Stornoway black pudding contains sheep lungs, which makes it banned in America. One of the most debated topics in all of Neolithic history, and I've already done a video on it, so there really is no need to discuss it further. Again, not sure why it's all the way down in tier 6, but there we go. Yeah, that one didn't age very well, did it? Moving on. Okay, this is one of those mad bits of history that we'll never know if it was a joke or not. The Blue Peacock was a British nuke project in the 50s that wanted to bury nuclear landmines in northern Germany that could be triggered by tripwire on an 8-day timer in order to fend off possible Soviet invasion. The problem was that when you bury landmines in winter, they get cold and the mechanisms can freeze or otherwise stop working. They tried a few solutions to the problem, and one that was proposed was putting live chickens in the casing with food and water to last them a week. That way the body heat would keep the mines from freezing until the chickens died a week later, after which the mechanism can trip as per the 8-day timer they had originally decided upon. This wasn't known until the Blue Peacock files were declassified in 2004, and theories abound as to whether this suggestion was an April Fool's joke that was filed with the project notes anyway, or that it was serious because civil servants can't tell jokes. Another one for its own video, I think, as it's sort of an unexplained mystery. The very short version is that in 1977 a Southern television broadcast was hijacked by someone playing a message claiming to be from Ashtar Galactic Command, which was a long-running UFO thing that needs a lot of explanation to get across. The mystery itself is half explained, as the broadcast station that was hijacked got their transmissions from another broadcast station instead of via landlines, leaving it wide open to hijacking, but the identity of whoever did it remains a mystery. I had to leave this one till last. The Iceberg wisely states, do not research next to the entry, but unfortunately as a 90s kid I am all too familiar with Mr. Blobby. If you've ever seen the memes about 90s television executives greenlighting even the maddest ideas because they're hopped up on cocaine the entire time, and you've wondered if that was true, then look no further than a Saturday night British TV show called Noel's House Party. Led by sort of national treasure Noel Edmonds, it was a light entertainment show based in the fictional town of Crinkley Bottom, with weird regular segments such as the Gunge Tank, where an unpopular celebrity or member of the public was voted by the audience to get covered in slime. It also featured a segment called Gotcha that was a typical celebrity prank scenario where hidden cameras were used to film celebs getting pranked by Noel and his team. This segment gave rise to the creature known through shuddering teeth as Mr. Blobby. He was created for Gotcha as a pretend popular kids TV character, and his sole purpose was to annoy the hell out of the celebs by being unprofessional and plain irritating. Weirdly, he rose to fame and was massively popular even though everybody hates him. Worse still, in 1993 he released a song that got to Christmas #1, beating Take That to the top spot in an upset that Gary Barlow is still annoyed about to this day. His appearance is weird enough, but his voice is the stuff of nightmares. Case in point. An article about him in the New York Times in 1994 described him as a metaphor for a nation gone soft in the head, and as we get to the end of this iceberg and all of the bizarre things in it, I think that is the perfect way to sign off your journey into the weirdness of the UK. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.